What if I told you that the reason empaths absorb other people's emotions isn't just some vague sensitivity or a mystical gift? That there's a hidden biological and psychological mechanism behind this, one that's been hiding in plain sight, quietly shaping how empaths experience the world. Imagine suddenly feeling waves of anxiety not your own, or inexplicably drained after being in a crowded room. For empaths, this isn't just imagination, it's reality. But why does this happen? What if the answer could unlock a new understanding of how our brains connect and sometimes overlap with others? Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll see empathy through a completely new lens, backed by surprising neuroscience, real-life stories, and a revelation that might change how you interact with people forever. Ready? Let's dive in. Let's start by understanding what it really means to be an empath, because it's far from the simple, "I feel for you" people often assume. Empaths don't just feel sadness when someone is sad or happiness when someone is happy. They experience other people's emotions as though those feelings are their own. The way an empath processes emotions is visceral, immediate, and at times overwhelming. Take Emily, for example, a friend of mine who always seemed to be the emotional barometer of any room. One afternoon, she went out to lunch with a colleague who was visibly stressed, jaw clenched, voice sharp, eyes darting anxiously. Emily expected a normal conversation, but left feeling utterly exhausted and anxious for several days afterward, despite not having any direct stressors in her life. What happened? She absorbed her coworker's stress to the point it disrupted her own emotional equilibrium. Now, here's a question. Why do empaths seem uniquely vulnerable to this emotional overload while most people brush things off? To understand that, we need to explore the idea of emotional contagion. Emotional contagion is a concept studied in psychology where emotions spread between people much like a cold spreads through a crowd. When someone smiles, you often feel happier. When someone yawns, you're likely to yawn too. So this emotional infection is part of how humans socially connect and build empathy. However, empaths take emotional contagion to another level. They don't just catch emotions in passing, they internalize them, sometimes without realizing it. The boundary between their own feelings and those of others becomes porous, making them feel responsible for or burdened by external emotions. This can make social interactions both deeply rewarding and profoundly exhausting. Consider the classic empath paradox. The very gift that makes empaths compassionate and insightful can also lead to burnout, anxiety, and intense loneliness if not managed properly. Their ability to tune deeply into emotional frequencies means they're sensitive to moods, tones, and even unspoken feelings. Over time, this constant tuning can feel like living inside a radio overloaded with static, too many channels, some with painful signals. This experience is so common, many empaths describe it as a drain on their soul or feeling physically heavy. In extreme moments, empaths may even experience psychosomatic symptoms, headaches, nausea, or sudden fatigue triggered by overwhelming emotional input. But why does this happen on a neurological level? Why does the empath's brain seem wired to absorb rather than simply recognize or understand others' emotions? To answer that, let's turn to the fascinating science behind emotional absorption next. At the core of the empath's experience lies a neurological phenomenon that neuroscientists have been studying for decades: mirror neurons. These are special brain cells discovered in the 1990s that fire both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing that same action. They're fundamental to imitation, learning, and, critically to empaths, understanding others' feelings. Imagine watching someone stub their toe and instantly flinching even though you're not injured. That's your mirror neurons activating. Now extend that idea to emotions. Mirror neurons allow you not just to recognize fear, joy, or pain in someone else, but to feel a shadow of it yourself. They create an internal emotional echo that connects you neurologically to another person's experience. For empaths, this echo seems to be amplified. Brain imaging studies, such as a 2013 experiment by researchers at the University of Toronto, suggest that empaths show increased activity and stronger connections within brain regions that process emotions and self-awareness. In other words, the parts of the brain that receive emotional signals and the parts that identify what's me versus other are less distinct. This neurological overlap means empaths don't just observe another's emotions, they live them internally as if they were their own. But here's the crucial nuance. The degree of this neural overlap or activation varies among individuals. While everyone has mirror neurons, empaths have them especially active, alongside a neurological blurring of emotional boundaries. This heightened connectivity means empaths respond to others' feelings with extreme intensity, sometimes to the point of confusion or emotional overwhelm. This also explains why simply trying to think positively doesn't always help empaths. Their emotional experience is not just in their thoughts, it's encoded in brain circuits that process sensory input, internal bodily states, and feelings almost automatically and unconsciously. Interestingly, the brain's insula, a region that integrates bodily sensations, emotions, and self-perception, also plays a strong role. Research shows that empaths have more pronounced insula activity when processing others' emotional states, enhancing their visceral experience of emotions like pain or sadness. That's why empaths sometimes experience what's called vicarious pain, where they literally feel physical discomfort upon witnessing someone else's suffering. But why would our brains evolve to make some people so intertwined emotionally with others? To answer that, we need to take a step back into evolutionary and psychological perspectives that uncover the hidden reason behind this extraordinary capacity for emotional absorption. The empath's remarkable ability to absorb emotions can be traced back to an evolutionary survival strategy that dates to humankind's earliest days. Imagine living in small tribal groups where survival depended on reading and responding to emotional cues, fear signaling danger, distress calling for aid, joy strengthening social bonds. For early humans, being able to sense emotions deeply and quickly was a distinct advantage. Those who could detect anxiety or aggression in others early were more likely to avoid danger. Those who could intuit when a family member was ill or troubled could offer care that increased group survival. In this context, heightened emotional sensitivity was a kind of evolutionary superpower, helping entire communities function harmoniously and react effectively. So empaths might be wired to overly absorb emotions because historically this helped their groups anticipate and respond promptly to threats or opportunities. Their hyper-tuned emotional radar wasn't a flaw, it was a lifeline. Fast forward to modern society and the landscape has shifted dramatically. The overwhelming sensory inputs, crowded subways, constant news cycles, social media overflowing with emotionally charged content means that empaths' ancient wiring is often working overtime, reacting as if real physical danger lurks everywhere. But these signals are mixed, intangible, and subtle, leading to emotional exhaustion and confusion. Beyond biology, psychology offers another key to this puzzle. Many empaths grow up in family environments where emotional attunement was critical. For example, children in chaotic or neglectful homes learn to constantly monitor others to avoid conflict or ensure emotional needs are met. Over time, this creates unconscious habits where absorbing others' emotions becomes a protective survival strategy. It's not just biology, it's also learned behavior. In such environments, emotional boundaries aren't clearly modeled or respected. Kids often grow up feeling responsible for others' emotional states to maintain family peace or safety. These childhood experiences effectively train the brain to blur distinctions between self and other emotional worlds. Combine this learned pattern with biological predisposition, and the empath is wired both by nature and nurture to absorb emotions deeply. This dual cause explains why empaths often report feeling overwhelmed, even when intellectually they know the emotions belong to someone else. The emotional experience isn't just cognitive, it's embodied and habitual. This perspective shifts the narrative from seeing empathic absorption as a mystical curse or frailty to understanding it as a complex survival adaptation, powerful but requiring balance. So how can empaths navigate this intense emotional landscape without losing themselves? Let's look at practical, real-life stories and strategies next. If you're an empath, knowing the mechanisms behind your emotional absorption is empowering. But what does this mean day to day? How do empaths thrive without getting overwhelmed by the emotional storms they pick up? Let me share Sarah's story. Sarah is a professional writer and a self-identified empath who spent years battling emotional burnout. Around age 30, she started noticing a pattern. After conversations with certain people or long days in crowded gatherings, she'd feel utterly drained, anxious, or even depressed, none of which matched her own life stressors. In therapy, Sarah learned to identify when emotions were hers and when they were others. One simple but transformative tool she discovered was journaling immediately after intense social interactions. By writing down her feelings and then analyzing whether those feelings aligned with her reality or someone else's, she developed awareness of emotional boundaries. Sarah also embraced mindfulness practices to anchor herself in her own body and emotional state. Rather than suppressing emotions, she learned to observe sensations and thoughts with curiosity, recognizing emotional waves without being swept away. Another key was setting intentional boundaries. Sarah started limiting time with particularly draining people or noisy environments and prioritized alone time to recharge. She found that saying no wasn't selfish, it was necessary for preserving her emotional well-being. Over months, this combination of recognizing emotional origins, mindfulness, and boundaries transformed her empathy from a draining burden into a meaningful strength. Sarah's experience aligns with findings from psychologists specializing in empath support. Techniques such as grounding exercises, visualization of emotional shields, and selective social exposure help empaths reduce overload and maintain control. It's important to highlight that this is not about shutting down empathy or becoming cold. Instead, it's about creating healthy emotional filters that allow empaths to care deeply without getting swallowed by others' feelings. With practice, empaths report feeling more energized, centered, and connected, not depleted. This ability to manage absorption doesn't just improve personal well-being, it enhances relationships, work dynamics, and creative endeavors, turning empathy into a superpower instead of a vulnerability. Here's something intriguing. Research increasingly suggests that empathy isn't a binary trait. You either are or you aren't an empath. Instead, empathy exists on a spectrum that includes everyone to varying degrees. Think about your own experiences. Have you ever walked into a room and suddenly felt a heavy mood, even if you didn't know why? Ever caught yourself mirroring someone's sadness or joy unexpectedly? These are glimpses of your own empathic wiring kicking in. Some studies find that under certain circumstances, stress, fatigue, deep connection, even people who don't identify as empaths become emotionally affected by others, though usually less intensely or frequently. This raises fascinating questions about human connection. If emotional absorption is part of how brains sync up socially, could cultivating awareness of this process help us all become better communicators and more compassionate people? It also underscores why setting boundaries and developing emotional self-awareness is not just for empaths, but an essential skill for everyone navigating relationships in a complex, emotionally charged world. So next time you feel swept up in someone else's emotions, remember it's not just your heart being too big. It's a deeply rooted biological and psychological dance we're only starting to uncover. If you found this eye-opening, subscribe for more deep dives into our minds and emotions, and share your own empath experiences below. I'd love to hear your stories. Thanks for watching. See you next time. If you'd like, I can also help with timings or further fine-tuning the style to keep the flow smooth and natural in spoken form. Just let me know.